I am sick to death of liberalism, as I'm sure lots of us are excessively glutted by atomising materialism, and I'm not the only one, it turns out. So, last couple of days, I have been at the National Conservatism Conference, which some of my colleagues have covered bits of in my absence, and so I'm going to do some dispatches from the floor, and I have to report that the conversation within the right is getting a lot healthier, and we've gotten to the point now where lots of us just don't care about what the progressives say about us. We just reject their moral framework outright. So we at the Lotus Eaters, turns out, have far more friends than we ever anticipated in the mainstream, and I'm here to report that we're actually doing something constructive. So, all good news. So before this conference started, I thought I'd just summarise the state of play as worded by Mary Harrington, who I spent most of the conference with as well, lovely woman. And she said, we don't have a Conservative Party in Britain, we have a Whig Gradualist Party and a Whig Accelerationist Party, because both Labour and Conservatives agree on the direction of travel. It's just how much money and how quickly are we going to get there, and also how are we going to sell it to the plebs? Are we going to pretend to be on their side, or are we just going to tell them openly that we're going to glut their country with immigrants and that their culture is disgusting? So we were kind of left politically high and dry. We still pretty much are. If you'd like to hear more from Mary, by the way, you can subscribe to the website. This was a free interview, but for as little as £5 a month, you can help us keep the lights on and keep us bringing guests in. This is my chat with her. Definitely someone who is on our side, so go and check that out. And she's right about the Conservative Party, at least from the leadership position, because this has come out recently, and this was a real point of contention at the conference, from the opening address to the end, and that was that immigration is slowly destroying Britain. That was not something you could say a couple of years ago. That's something that we discussed in my first podcast on the channel about how we could not get a house, which you put all the data on, and that was something that they were discussing explicitly there. The leadership at the top is still reluctant to commit to this position, because Rishi Sunak was asked, with the projections that now from the conference there's going to be a net migration this year of 700,000 to a million, so that's plus a million foreigners. He has refused to commit to lowering migration numbers. So we had last year an all-time high of 504,000, and he said, speaking to reporters at the G7 en route to the G7 summit in Japan, I've inherited some numbers and I want to bring those numbers down. Right. You've inherited the numbers, yes. You were part of the government that pushed those numbers up. You also haven't said what you bring them down to, and you're the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I do love it when you've got the guy who's been in government is like, well, I inherited this situation from myself.
Yes.
So I've inherited my bank account from myself as well. It's terrible. Terrible news for everyone.
But it's also, you're the Prime Minister. You could do something about this instantly. Why don't you? It's almost like you want it to continue. Well, fortunately, the conversation is changing, and there are actually many MPs and journalists and academics and younger Conservatives, small c, which are holding them to account. And that was the leading thing that came out of this conference that was gratefully organised. And I must say as well, felt surrounded by people that came up to us, that said their view as the Lotus Eaters, that said that they appreciate the things that we're saying and that we're moving the conversation. So it was really moralising. So I wanted to move on first to Louise Perry's speech, because this was a great example of the contrast between the message that's coming out of the Tory party, which is materialism, GDP line go up, we've got to have high-skilled immigration, something I learned at this conference. You know their definition of high-skilled when they wanted to bring
£27,000 a year?
Yeah. They dropped it to about 20 grand odd. Right. Definitely high-skilled, which is pretty much below graduate wages, and that Liz Truss was considering free movement with India at one point as well. Didn't you say recently that you'd heard rumours that the Australian and Canadian governments were thinking about free movement with the UK as well?
Yeah.
Right.
To be honest, I think anyone English should just leave.
I don't think I could live anywhere else, though. Sentimentally, I don't think I could live anywhere else.
But it's just, I look at the numbers in terms of, like Peter Hitchens was sat there one day just looking at the numbers and quoting them on some BBC panel. And he was just like, yeah, I've given up. I was like, yeah, I know. Usually you've given up, but like he just lists how bad it was in terms of if you could just go to Canada or Australia, especially for the nurses or doctors. I mean, there's a reason we have to import so many in the UK. Is because everyone we train just leaves.
Yeah, I spoke to a guy who is actually a current practicing doctor who says everyone within the NHS hates the system, but we just can't do anything about it because the management are there. So he's moving to Australia in the next few months.
But the salary is not even double. It's more than double.
Yeah.
To go to Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, who's going to turn that down?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. See. Fortunately, though, the reason I don't want to flee is because there is actually a counter movement that is manifesting, and my overall message of this is the Conservative Party is definitely going to lose. Yes, Labour are going to get in. It's going to suck. They're going to be slightly faster at destroying the country than the Conservatives are. But as the Conservatives enter defeat, it allows us a chance to give them a boot up the backside, and that's good. So I wanted to go to Louise first, and this is a great example. Go back, please, John. Louise is a great example because I spoke to her on the channel. She's a former Labour Party member. She's friends with Joanna Cherry. She was for many years, and since she's become smacked by reality, she's become slowly more and more conservative. And she really represented this position of immigration is lowering house buying and is specifically lowering birth rates. And that was a major point of this conference. It was young people not having any kids, and the government is actively disincentivizing them having them. And she articulated the conservative position really well. So in this speech, which I encourage everyone goes watch, I'm not going to play all the clips because we won't have the time. She compared the abandonment of tradition to the Portuguese mismanagement of the importing of a fruit called cassava from the New World. So when the Portuguese rocked up to the Americas, they found that all the Native Americans were like scraping, washing this weird fruit, and they thought that they were wasting their time doing that. They thought it was ritualistic. Turns out cassava is loaded with cyanide, but the cyanide is only in trace amounts. So if you eat loads of cassava, it builds up within you and poisons you, and the scraping, washing, and all that was getting the cyanide out of the fruit. So you don't necessarily know why people do things, but they might have a practical reason, so you shouldn't just throw them away. And she was saying the same thing with sort of postnatal practices, like when a woman would have her family around her rather than just shipping the kids off to daycare. That might have some unforeseen consequences. And so in this, she said something. Demographic imbalance may well represent the greatest threat to the long-term stability of Britain, and indeed the rest of the world. Put simply, our age pyramid no longer looks like a pyramid. An aging population depends on working-age adults to fund the welfare system. An economic system dependent on high levels of debt also depends on above-replacement birth rates. The whole system is a Ponzi scheme, reliant on continued population growth in order to sustain itself. Immigration can offset the problem, it cannot solve it. If birth rates continue to collapse, then so too will the welfare state. Right now, we're witnessing the process of demographic crisis in its early stages, and most people do not recognize it as such. If modernity is cassava, then this is the cyanide. When would we have been able to say that like 2 years ago? Would have been the great replacement conspiracy theory. It would have been that we're trying to make women birth cattle like it's the Handmaid's Tale. Again, conversation is moving substantively, even a year on after I first joined this company, and we were talking about the thing that we couldn't talk about, which is how immigration stops you from getting a house. Gradually, within the right, the conversation is changing. And I wanted to highlight this particularly because Miriam Cates led one of the first talks, if we go to the next one, John, in the conference. Now, Miriam Cates is a backbench MP, but she's fast becoming everyone's favourite MP because she is someone who has seen segments from this show. I spoke to her, very nice woman. She is someone who is doing the parliamentary inquiry into the exact kind of materials you covered in your last segment, which is the inappropriate sex education stuff, and she has sanction from Rishi Sunak to do so. Now, I'm not saying Rishi Sunak genuinely believes in conservatism, but at least she's got the go-ahead from the government to investigate the goings-on in schools that are untowards. But she hasn't stopped there. She's actually a genuine social conservative, and recently, as I covered with Dan, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, decided to try and increase birth rates by funding daycare from ages 9 months to 2 years to the tune of 30 hours a week. So the government is going to pay someone else to take care of your kids rather than cut your taxes so you can stay home with your own kids. And obviously the exact kind of state employees educating them are going to be giving them the exact kind of scat books that you were covering last time. So this is an openly socialist policy pushed by a conservative government. No shock given Jeremy Hunt's wife is a member of the CCP. And when asked about this, Miriam Cates decided to come out and condemn it. She said, "It is absolutely wrong. I can't think of a policy that's been announced during the last 3 years that I've been more upset about. I've got to be honest, I did shed a tear on the day that a government... I shed a tear as a government minister on the day that it was announced because, well, it's utterly unconservative. The idea that the role of a parent, the role of a mother, is to get back to work and contribute to GDP, and that you can somehow outsource that unbreakable bond to institutional childcare, as brilliant as those care workers might be, no one can replace mum." We're seeing a move away from conservatism more towards the relational language that people like Carl have been talking about for quite some time. This is the point. We might be demoralised here as both presenters and an audience, seeing all this awful news all the time and feeling like we're just talking to ourselves all the time. But it turns out some people are actually listening. And so I wanted to draw attention to Miriam Cates' opening speech because I wanted to draw a contrast between her reception and the reception of some of the academics like Louise Perry versus the government ministers, and we'll see the direction of travel. So if you can play the first clip, please, John.
I've no doubt we'll have fascinating debates, but these issues are peripheral at best, unless we first turn our attention to the most pressing issue of our generation. I don't care if you're a red Tory, a communitarian, a follower of Burke, or, heaven forbid, a libertarian free marketeer. None of these traditions has a future. None of our philosophical musings or policy proposals will amount to anything long-lasting unless we address the one overarching threat to British conservatism, and indeed the whole of Western society. No, it's not climate change. It's not Russia or China or Iran. It's not the neo-Marxist ideology that has so weakened our institutions. It's not inflation or taxation or poor productivity. No, there is one critical outcome that liberal individualism has completely failed to deliver, and that is babies. Across the nations of the developed world, the birth rate is collapsing. In the 1960s, British women had an average of around 2.6 children each. Now it's fewer than 1.6. For the first time ever last year, half of women reached their 30th birthday without having a child. The fertility rate in the UK is now well below replacement, and it continues to fall. Now, perhaps you're thinking this is not a problem, or only a minor problem, or a problem for the future. But there simply is no future if we don't reverse this trend. A fertility rate of 1.55 is not gradual decline. Even without further fall in just 2 generations' time, there will be 40% fewer births than there are today. That is population collapse.
Now, I remember a time, a couple of years ago, where if we said that there is a demographic issue, and that if we had demographic collapse that will allow other nations and other values to outcompete us and allow our ideals to go extinct, we were maligned as alt-right, and lots of people conceded grounds to the screaming leftists who want nothing more than to destroy our civilization. And now, mainstream politicians are saying it in front of cameras. That's a pretty substantial move on the discourse. That's a really positive development. And she's cutting against, as a backbencher, the current government that's doing it, and positioning herself as someone who could change the conversation when the Conservatives ultimately lose. And she's laying the blame directly there at the feet of materialism, consumerism, atomized individual liberalism. So she's talking in a completely different moral language than what the current progressive bi-party consensus are doing. There's a deliberate breakaway more towards our side of the argument. It's quite encouraging. Let's go on to the next one.
British economic, industrial, educational and social policies over recent decades have collectively increased the cost and diminished the returns of raising children. But having a home and a secure job and support from your family, community and nation are not the only preconditions to starting a family. You must also have hope for the future. And that hope is sadly diminishing in so many of our young people today. Because liberal individualism has proven to be completely powerless to resist the cultural Marxism that is systematically destroying our children's souls. When culture, schools and universities openly teach that our country is racist, our heroes are villains, humanity is killing the earth, you are what you desire, diversity is theology, boundaries are tyranny, and self-restraint is oppression, is it any wonder that mental health conditions, self-harm, suicide, and epidemic levels of anxiety and confusion characterize the emerging generation? If we do not teach our children to value, to be proud of our nation and its history, is it any surprise that they do not want to be responsible for continuing it? Liberalism is literally dying out.
So that was a critique that would have only been consigned to our website and the kind of conversations that Carl's been having with Stelios, or even a couple of years ago, AA's video saying that the libertarians and the liberals were making the same materialist argument as the Marxists, and so they struggle to persuade the younger generation when they're promising more freedom or more prosperity. Well, the Marxists have a more persuasive way of framing that, particularly when you can do less to get more, hypothetically. And now, again, mainstream conservative politicians are identifying that and breaking away from the Blairite paradigm that has captured both parties. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts, but it is seeming quite encouraging to me that they're listening.
Maybe I not saying that none of that has an impact, of course it does, but the main reason I think that the birth rates have become what they are is because you just don't need kids anymore, ever since you have a massive welfare state. Because the whole reason I have kids is so someone can take care of you when you're older. And if you don't need that, well, then you don't have to.
Yeah,
Because we're not talking about people who are engaged politically at all. We're talking about dinos over here. Why are they not having kids? And
no, some of them are. This is the point. So actually, and I'm speaking to Stephen Shaw later, the people that are having one child go on to have more than one. But there's loads of people that never have any kids at all.
Yeah.
And so the dinos are having kids, but there's loads of people that never even get their start.
yeah,
And so
because
why?
you don't need them.
Well, you do. So the actual inverting of the pyramid scheme to pay for social welfare means that eventually the tax base is going to run dry and the pension pot's going to go low. And also, if you keep importing migrant workers to take care of your elderly relatives, they're just going to get continually abused.
Yeah, like the system needs it to continue.
Yes.
And if you don't have the kids, then you've got to import people. That's what the elite solution has been. But the fundamental reason as to why that change seems to have happened, in my view, is because I could get old, get a pension, and not have to worry about my well-being because Daddy State will take care of me. Whereas if you make that no longer true, well then, yeah, everyone needs to have kids because someone's got to take care of you. And I'd much rather it be the family that takes care of you because they'll do a better job on average.
Yeah, and that's the Conservative position that's being articulated there. And it's not being articulated by anyone in government, but it has been being articulated by people that are both in this office and sympathetic to us. And it seems to have finally reached the ears of either staffers or MPs themselves that are now saying this on national platforms. So we are having an impact. She also used, which I thought was quite interesting, the phrase national contraceptive to describe how all these economic factors are basically castrating people, prolonging their adolescence, sticking them in universities and making them put off children indefinitely, which was a phrase coined by my friend Nina Skinner in a Mallard article. And Mallard is another outlet that's just sympathetic to us. So again, small grains, big heap. The most interesting part of this, though, and linking back to her criticism of Hunt, was her specific part on going to war against the daycare system. And I want to listen to what she says and then contrast it with another article because it sounds awfully familiar. Let's play this clip, please.
The Chancellor's recent announcement that the taxpayer will spend £4 billion on childcare for babies from 9 months old to get women back into work devalues the crucial role of motherhood. There is no shortage of evidence supporting the long-term benefits of a mother's physical closeness and nurture for the first 2 or 3 years of a child's life. And polling reveals that the majority of mothers want to spend more time with their very young children. And yet this childcare policy implies that the chief role of a mother should be as a GDP contributor whilst outsourcing her child to the state. The language of many politicians and commentators paints motherhood as an oppressive drudgery that any self-respecting woman wants to avoid, and stay-at-home mothers as lazy, economically inactive, or unambitious. When motherhood is so undermined and undervalued by public policy, is it any wonder that fewer and fewer women choose the role? And the great hypothesis of the liberal elite that women have babies in order to outsource their care as quickly as possible, that women should derive more fulfillment from a paid job, any job, than they do from nurturing their own children, is just a thought experiment, one that is in conflict with empirical evidence and biological reality. It's not progressive. It's a fantasy that is slowly strangling Western nations.
So it's interesting that she's making the argument for the privileging of the oikos, the family, as the primary mode of political selection over the individual and the political sphere. And this sounds awfully familiar. If we scroll down, please, John, because a little while ago I did an article on, speaking of her again, Mary Harrington's book. Mary's a good friend of Miriam Cates. And I wrote about this childcare policy. And I'm not saying that Miriam derived it from me, because there was also a friend of mine, Portia, who did a similar article in The Spectator. But again, this all sounds very similar. So I wrote, in the spring budget, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt announced his intent to subsidise 30 hours a week of childcare for 1- and 2-year-olds. The celebration of this policy by self-professed Conservatives is perplexing. This redistributive approach to making families more affordable is a continuation, rather than a reversal, of the displacement of the family by the state of the primary unit of political power. It regards motherhood as a temporary impediment to women's total workforce enrolment, aiming at eliminating time out of work altogether. It fails to discriminate between stronger two-parent and weaker single-parent models of family. This both omits the role of a father as provider as integral and the well-being of the child as the primary concern. It subordinates the entitlement of a child to be raised by loving parents to the state's desire to register the economically inactive domain of motherhood on a GDP growth graph. It is fundamentally unconservative to make the economic viability of starting a family contingent on the managerial economic efficiency of the state. It seems that Miriam and I are indirectly echoing each other here. So again, we may be marginalised by leftists like Otto English or Guardian readers or whatever, but we actually have a lot more influence than we think. Our message seems to be getting out there. It's a white pill. We shouldn't be demoralised here. Now, of course, people on the self-reported right decided to counter-signal Miriam Cates. If we go over to the Spectator article, from Zoe Strimple, who I've had conflicting reports as to whether or not she has children, because she says she's raised 2 children in here, but I've also heard that she may also be childless, so could be totally worthless advice. Miriam Cates and I have a totally different idea of what Thatcherism is all about. She doesn't understand that she's not talking about liberal materialism. She just doesn't get it. These people don't get it. Our critics are speaking from a totally different moral position that we don't have to accept. To me, the Lady T era was more feminist than any other, or after, because it included all people, including women, in its vision of work, wealth, power and success. What Thatcher knew is that everyone likes money, even lefties, especially money they've earned themselves. Creating an environment in which people can reap the rewards of their work, of their wealth, was something she could do. Speaking as someone whose mother worked full-time while raising 2 children, the no one can replace mum idea seems naive and uncreative, strongly rooted in sentimentalised Victorian ideals of domesticity. It's also a little misleading. No one is replacing mum, but someone, or some people, are allowing little Juno or Oscar, how insufferably middle class, to be looked after brilliantly, while mum can continue to build her career, retain professional confidence, stay sane. She just hates children. That's it. This is why you don't understand what Miriam Cates is saying. Totally different moral worldviews. Shore up family resources, which will in turn help when little Oscar wants to go to an expensive university. Alright, so I can work to palm them off on someone else and pay my wages to palm them off on someone else, and then palm them off on a university, and wonder why when they come back, they hate me, I have no relationship with them, and they're taken in by leftist politics. Why could the Conservatives possibly be losing? It's not family first.
The hell does she even mean expensive university? The state pays for university.
Yeah.
Like, we get a loan in this country, but you don't need to pay it back unless you earn over a certain amount, and it gets wiped in 30 years. Like, unless she's talking, she's going to send them to, I don't know if there are universities like this in the UK, like Eton, where you've got to spend 12 grand a semester or something up front. My point is, she doesn't seem to be engaging with reality at all.
Maybe the only way I could strawman it is if you were sent to Oxbridge for your masters and you took the maximum loan, but obviously it wouldn't cover the course costs and the accommodation costs.
I think there might be some truth to her not having kids, because she doesn't seem to
Yeah,
know how it
I don't
works.
think she does. Yeah, no. I have been informed and reliably. Yeah, she seems like an idiot. For this reason, Rishi and Hunt's childcare policy, aimed at making it easier for women to go back to work after having children, is a good one because it channels the spirit of Thatcher. You moron. That's exactly why Miriam Cates hates you. She is saying, I don't want Thatcherism. I do not want the ghost of Margaret Thatcher inhabiting the Tory party. Neoliberalism and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race, mainly because it's going to discontinue the human race if it keeps going on. And so it doesn't matter if it's anti-Thatcher or anti-feminist. She hates it because it's directed to send mothers back to work and atomise them from their children. We have completely incommensurate moral worldviews, and we should double down on ours, because you have had your time. So Danny Kruger decided to double down, another MP that's very much on our side. He actually voted for the mandatory care jab for a while, and then since has expressed such regret that he decided to speak out against the WHO, misspeak, but same thing I suppose, pandemic treaty recently, and on side effects of unspecified medical treatment. I'll leave it at that. Nice fella. And so in his speech, he unreservedly said, the normative family, the mother and the father sticking together for the sake of the children, is the only basis for a safe and functioning society. Marriage is not only about you, it's a public act to live for the sake of someone else. And this actually had, I haven't got the link here, but Pink News crying, saying, this is the most anti-LGBTQ plus conference ever. Yeah. Don't care. Sorry. I'm going to have kids. I'm going to have a nice little family. And I'm not going to be an unwholesome degenerate. And I'm not going to apologise for it. Don't have to listen to you. Now, the interesting thing is that these two speeches bookended Suella Braverman's speech. And this is the contrast I wanted to draw. So I'm not going to play any clips from this. Again, watch it in your own time. As you can see, if you're looking on the video there, she's got a teleprompter in the corner. She's the only person across all 3 days that brought teleprompters in. So it felt very much like she showed up for her hour. She did or half an hour rather, did a premature leadership bid that was entirely scripted, disconnected from the audience, and didn't watch the morning where Miriam Cates, Mary Harrington, Louise Perry had been dunking on liberalism, because some quotes from this, that again, the media hasn't reported and framed properly, because the only thing you'll see from Suella's speech and Jacob Rees-Mogg is that the protesters showed up and tried disrupting it. They tried disrupting the most moderate of speakers, ironically. She told her parents' story about being immigrants, coming to Britain and working their way up. She described Britain as a paragon of democracy, equality, and opportunity. None of those are conservative phrases. It's just boilerplate liberalism. Again, she did say...
How is this a paragon of opportunity, this island?
Yeah.
Okay, whatever.
Yeah, our house prices are now 12 times the average income, thanks to you guys. And I know she wants to lower immigration, but she, again, has been in the party that has slowly eroded all of the institutions of Britain and its affordability. So thanks. She did say, to her credit, the British identity isn't simply interchangeable with liberal values, and then went on to say that the purpose of conservatism is to protect fundamental rights and liberal values. So we've got conservative liberalism. You're a Blairite. You're just a through and through Blairite, and this is why she did not get as warm a reception as Miriam Cates or Danny Kruger. She got the obligatory applause at the end, but most of the time I was passing notes over WhatsApp going, you know the say the line Bart meme? The most cheers she got is when she said 100% of women don't have a penis. Wow, thank you. That is the level of discourse we've gotten to. I'm glad the Conservative Party knows primary school level biology, and that deserves cheers. I'm not accepting that level of slop when my country is being flooded by people that hate me that I have to pay for, and lots of other politicians and journalists aren't taking it either. This isn't good enough, and you have been upstaged by other people that are moving the conversation, that are thankful to listen to us. So thank you very much. So if we can go to this next one. I just wanted to play this clip, because interspersed between attending the conference, I went on GB News and did my usual bit with Michelle Dewberry, which is very lovely. And this woman here is Jo Phillips, and she's actually a pretty entrenched person in the media class. She's quite nice off air, but on air she was flabbergasted by the fact that I didn't play by the Liberal Handbook. And I wanted to play this clip, not to do Leo and only play my own clips, but because I think this is the kind of language I would hope that we would use when addressing these people, when addressing the boomer truth paradigm, and when not accepting their normative framework. Because I had just turned around and said that Suella Braverman was a liberal, and also that Miriam Cates was right about daycare, and she lost her mind. So if we can play this, please.
You know, there are lots of places for these things, but I think everything is so very toxic, and what I think we're seeing is a manoeuvring as to who's going to take over from Rishi Sunak.
Well, you was there. Do you think it was toxic?
No, it was very constructive, actually. And I think the reason you think it's toxic is because for the last 30, 40 years, there's been a neoliberal Blairite consensus paradigm where we're moving in one direction, and both parties have bought onto it. They're just arguing over the speed of travel. That's why within the tent, and even among some of the MPs, they were saying our party's pretty much indistinguishable from the Labour Party in terms of where we want to go. It's just how much we want to spend getting there. And so I'm not surprised that you think that this is inappropriate or toxic, because you're part of that consensus. The people that are at that conference want a radically different view.
You don't know what I'm part of, actually.
Well, you're formerly Liberal Democrat, right?
I was, yes. I'm not a member of the Conservative
Party. But you're saying, for example, that immigration and the culture wars are not chief concerns, whereas
they're not.
For us, they definitely
are. But for you, within a small part of the Conservative Party...
I think you overstate how small it actually is, and I think that's why many people are checking out of politics, because they don't feel substantially represented by the members that are in Westminster.
But what's happening is that this is not helping the Conservative Party by seeing, you know, whether this is a move further to the right, who can be more right-wing than the next lot.
Well, can I check, what do you call right-wing? Because what we were just talking about a second ago is incentivising family units. We were talking about people doing entry-level jobs in some cases when perhaps they're currently not incentivised to go out and work. So those kind of things, managing your borders, what do you determine to be right-wing?
Well, I think things like, you know, extending childcare and saying that's anti-conservative.
But wasn't he saying...
Because, so what you're doing, specifically for Jeremy Hunt, is you're making it so that motherhood is an enterprise that must register on the state's GDP balance sheet.
Right. So what do you think, that women should stay at home and look after children?
Yes. That's
really?
If they have the children,
Do you know what? We're in 2023.
I don't care about current year. I'm sorry.
Right.
I don't... It doesn't
and
matter.
this is what's worrying, that this is this American imported...
It's not an American import. Hang on. You've got no.
Fundamentalist, stay-at-home, motherhood
whatever you
and
like, but the burden of proof is on you, because the mass daycare industry is a recent innovation versus how human beings have been biologically and historically raised. And what's best for the child... Great example. There's a meta-analysis...
Do you have children?
Not yet. I'd really love to. I really would.
And you'll expect your partner, if she's a woman, to stay at home and look after the children?
The partner I would pick would want to stay at home with the children.
Would they? OK.
Yes.
Michelle, you and I should go home, because clearly we shouldn't...
I'm not saying women...
So the point I wanted to make with that is that she didn't feign outrage throughout the entire thing. She's just genuinely incapable of understanding beyond the consensus paradigm that she has inhabited, that she has benefited from for the last few years, that I wouldn't want to abide by that. That Miriam Cates, that Mary Harrington wouldn't want to abide by that. And it's because, frankly, your inability to get a housemate, have suffered under that paradigm. We want to check out.
I just love the chats being like, raising children is American. Okay.
Yeah, I know, yeah. Yeah, it's an American import. You couldn't have these ideas yourself.
I've run into that so many times as well with MPs. They're just like, oh, you want to be like America. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
How does that come into the conversation?
Yeah. And also, like, oh, who funds you? It's like, nobody. That's why I can't have a house. That's why I'm broke.
It does make you wonder, like, it's the person who starts asking, well, you must be funded by big money or something. It's like, no, how would I get that?
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah. I wish.
like no one else who works in like online media who is funded by the audience ever asks that question. I find it's only people who come from some kind of weird shadowy organization who was like, yeah, well, who funds you? I was like, nobody. What about you? Oh, I get funded by this such and such foundation. Yeah, of course you do.
Young Turks do not want to talk about their backers, I am sure. So my point with that clip is not just to promote me, but the point is that we don't have to accept their framing. We can say that the things we want are good, that they have had their time, that we do not want the same direction of travel as them, and it doesn't matter if they're outraged, doesn't matter if they're indignant, doesn't matter if they say, but it's current year. I don't accept your paradigm. I don't want the same things as you. Goodbye. I've had enough. So let's go to day 2. The highlight of day 2, or the low light, I suppose, because most of day 2 was pretty boring, I'm going to be honest, was Michael Gove. So Michael Gove showed up and he didn't want to do a speech. Instead, he was convinced with Madeline Grant of the Telegraph to do a sit-down conversation, and they didn't take any questions. And Michael Gove was asked a pretty direct question. Do you think that there are any MPs that would be better at home in the Lib Dems? Because lots of people in this audience have said that the Conservative Party currently is indistinguishable from them. And he said, I could not name a single MP. Now, right off the top of my head, and we'll mention some of these shortly, I can name like Caroline Noakes, for example, that wants 50-50 Parliament and hates my guts. Or Michael Gove himself, because when asked what are some substantive achievements from a Conservative government for the last 13 years, he said the streamlining of universal credit, which means putting all of the benefits into one stream, which now has 5 million dependents, a record number of people getting handouts from the government. And also, and this is a direct quote, the diversity, both superficial and intellectual, of our institutions. Superficial. Superficial diversity is an achievement for Michael Gove. So more Browns equals more good, Conservative Party 2023. And you wonder why we hate you.
Oh, God. I mean, you do wonder sometimes how stupid they are, but then I'll say that.
You're poor, but at least you're governed by an Indian man. I don't care.
Line is going up, is it not? Oh, it's not. Crap.
Bugger. Yeah. So, again, the encouraging thing about this, though, was that he was included to the detriment of Calvin Robinson, by the way, who, very nice to get a pint with him again. He'll be back on the show soon at some point, and I'll be on his show on Saturday. Calvin was scheduled to speak. He was promoted to speak, and he was scheduled to speak on the same day as Michael Gove. And Michael Gove says, we don't want to bring too much God into this conversation, so they had to try and move Calvin to the Wednesday, but Calvin was flying out to the USA. So Calvin was debooked at the request of Michael Gove. So you can see the containment trying to be enforced on a conference that had very good intentions from the top. And people sussed this out because when Michael Gove said all these things, dead silence. No claps like for Cates, or Harrington, or Perry. Dead silence. You are a dinosaur, you have ruined the country, and we are moving past you. We don't care about the outrage of Lib Dems, and we don't care about the ideas of Lib Dems masquerading as Tories for the last decade. You are pointless. So if we move on to the final day, one of the highlights that I wanted to include, and I know I'm skipping over some of the talks by Matthew Goodwin, who should hopefully be in soon, Emma Webb, who gave a fantastic defence of tradition, but the highlight of day 3 for me was really David Starkey. David Starkey's a very nice fella. I've spoken to him a few times off air. It would be lovely to have him on the show. And again, this just shows the contrast of how we don't care anymore. So in David Starkey's speech, he spoke mainly about how we can appeal to history, not necessarily other avenues, to defend British culture. Because British culture, unlike other nationalisms, which he said are poisonous, that's what Douglas Murray brought up on the dinner in the Natural History Museum on Monday night. He said just because the Germans have screwed it up twice inside a century doesn't mean that Britain shouldn't be proud of its own heritage. David Starkey said that Britain has a unique history of conservative revolutions and moral iteration that make it the best country in the world. And I wholeheartedly agree with him. And in that framing, he said that there are movements, specifically like the Black Lives Matter movement, which are disingenuous. So decolonization is not a goal towards moral progress, but instead, quote, they are attempts at destroying the entire legitimacy of the Western cultural tradition. The idea that they are here to defend black lives is preposterous. They do not care about black lives. They only care about the symbolic destruction of white cultures. There is a determination to replace the Holocaust with slavery, which is why Jews are under such attack by the left, because they are jealous, fundamentally, of the moral primacy of the Holocaust. So David Starkey went for the throat there. He decided not to abide by the intersectional stack and said instead that, okay, the Holocaust is the stick with which to beat German culture, because German culture taken to its excesses produces totalitarianism, and the critical race theorists want to displace the Holocaust with slavery as the primary sin of the total West, so that they can attack, in the same way that the Germans are perpetually terrified of becoming Nazis again, attack the West as being eternally terrified of succumbing to slavery again. I think he's identified something really good there.
It's a foundational myth. So every society, at least in the West, is foundationally set upon the Holocaust, I would say. It's why even in Britain we get berated about the Holocaust. It's like, we literally were the ones stopping it, bro.
It's the post-war boomer paradigm.
What do you want? And in the United States, you'll find this most apparent in their set of foundational myths, obviously includes the Holocaust somehow, even though they're the ones who stopped it, but also segregation and slavery. And it's why whenever you hear a speech from an American left-wing politician, that's the 3 points in history they ever know about. That's it. It's the only 3 things they can mention. It's the only 3 things they can reliably say and know the audience know about as well, because their entire society is, well, has that as its foundation. These are our 3 points of history, really. Well, if you're a left-wing American, because, of course, you can pick any foundational myth you want for your society, and you don't have to pick foreign genocide, for one, which makes no sense, or the slave trade. It's like, no. I mean, for the United States, the things you'd pick would be, I don't know, the Revolutionary War as your foundational myth. And right-wing Americans do that, rightfully so, and accurately to what America is. Because the other parts don't really help you explain it. I mean, you could guess that, I don't know, you could argue that maybe desegregation helps you understand America. Maybe slavery, but I mean, definitely not the Holocaust helps you understand why America is what it is.
No.
It's a weird foundational myth point. But he's absolutely right that they instead, you can see this bickering between...
Diane Abbott.
No, well, yeah, you get it often between money leftists, but the bickering between who had it worse in history, and it's just like, I'm going to let you guys fight, I'm leaving.
Yeah, these are the intersectional fault lines. It's the same between, as you've pointed out past with the Birmingham protest, the Islamists and the LGBTQ lobby. In America particularly, there's a contention between the black Hebrew Israelites, exactly, and the Jewish community, who would like to determine who is more oppressed. And so Starkey is not abiding by cultural taboos here. He's saying that our enemies are trying to hoist us by our own standards and that we shouldn't stand for it. And even though the Huffington Post can cry and whine, they point out, and this is in the article, his speech on Wednesday morning was met with applause from the audience.
Because it was true.
Yeah. And so from a position sitting through the auditorium, it's very telling as to what the crowd wanted. And the really encouraging thing is, as well, not just were there loads of our viewers there who came up and said hello and congratulated the whole team on our work, 30% of the attendees were under 30. It's pretty major. These are the people that are going to be having kids. These are the people that are going to be transmitting the values, and they're on our side. And so I just wanted to finish with a contrast between what the Conservative Party think of Starkey versus what we and the attendees thought of Starkey. Because this happened about 2 weeks ago now, the coronation of King Charles III. And David Starkey, and I think this was just after I ran into him on the same day, funnily enough. I was privileged to be invited to the outside Buckingham Palace pre-coronation coverage, and David was there in the little alcove in a blanket, awaiting to speak to Nigel, freezing her. And when he was asked about the coronation preparations, and he said that Rishi Sunak had been noticeably invisible. And he said, I think one of the reasons that I think that a lot has gone wrong, for example, why Parliament has not been properly represented at the coronation of a parliamentary monarchy, is because the government simply isn't interested. It's not interested in the constitution. You have a Prime Minister, I think, a man of immense talent, of extraordinary skill, debatable, but not really fully grounded in our culture. That's all he said. And so the Tory wets called him racist. This is from Nadim Zahawi, who is the party chairman.
Race.
Yep, never mentioned it at all.
Stop losing that word.
He said about he's constitutionally illiterate and disinterested in parliamentary history. Now bear in mind, David Starkey particularly focuses on the Tudor period, so he knows a hell of a lot about the formation of the Church of England, about the creation of English constitutional norms.
Yeah, but what does he know?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, actually, ironically, that's their position. What does that guy know?
Yeah, well, Nadim Zahawi, who has been kicked out of plenty of jobs for not paying his taxes and for manipulating YouGov's results during the pandemic as the chair of YouGov, while also being the vaccine minister, said, "That is an ill-informed opinion, a racist opinion. He only needs to spend a few hours with Rishi or me in Stratford-upon-Avon or Yorkshire to realise how our culture is strong and has been rooted in diversity, pride and love."
No, it's not been true.
That's not true at all.
1997.
Yeah.
Like, you could argue it's been rooted since then, but there was kind of a bit more of history before 97.
But you
Some
can't...
other things might have happened.
You can't have a cultural value be diversity. That's an oxymoron. Because that means our culture is preferring other cultures. That would be cannibalism. That's stupid.
Since 97, it has been that. Like, he is correct. There has been a revolution in that terms. And that's how they view all of British culture and history now.
Yep.
Through the Blairist lens. Whereas, obviously, Starkey is like, there was other history.
Yeah.
Some things happened before the 1990s, and Starkey's got them, such as, I don't know, being a heretic or a heathen would make you not fully rooted in our culture for a heavily Anglican ceremony about the king.
Funny that you said that. Calvin got lambasted for the same thing, for saying that Rishi Sunak is a heathen, because definitionally,
he's a
Hindu.
Yeah, he's a heathen, yeah.
Yeah. So, doesn't mean he should be
What do you want?
100 and quarter for
doesn't
it.
mean he's a bad guy. I'm not going to pass laws being like, cut off his head.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
you're not Islamic. Exactly. Well, actually, technically. I've seen you in the Afghan garb. And then I'll just finish from a quote from our favourite Lib Dem Tory MP, Caroline Noakes, who said, "What a vile and racist comment to make. The PM grew up in my constituency and is as British as both me and David Starkey." He didn't say he wasn't British. "The coronation is a great opportunity for us all to celebrate our wonderful and diverse culture." And Starkey's comment says far more about him than the PM. You're right. It says far more about Starkey. And it says far more about
educated man.
Well, you know what? It says far more about the actual Conservatives that are in this conference. Because notice, Starkey wasn't debooked, he wasn't cancelled, he was applauded, he was platformed, the Twitter account shared all of his quotes, he was celebrated. This was the prevailing mood at this conference. So this is the point. This is why I wanted to talk about it. We're actually being listened to. And so the Conservative Party are absolutely going to be defeated. And I think, frankly, deservedly so. They're cancerous and they need time in remission. Fortunately, that time in exile allows us, MPs like Miriam Cates and Danny Kruger, and all of you out there who attended this conference and said hello, to have more influence than we ever thought possible. So chin up, lads. We're going to make it.
Hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. And if you want to support our work, you need to go on down to our website where you can sign up and watch videos such as this one, which is Epochs, our history series. This one's about the Wall Street crash. And also, if you want to check out what Bo, whose series this is up to on Twitter, make sure to check him out at HistoryBro1.